So, how many scales do you need to know to play jazz? Well, the answer is easy. None. Or hundreds. So, this is a basic question. I think people are very interested in scales if they study jazz, often because they come from, I don't know, prog rock and stuff like that, where there's a lot of scales. So my answer to this question is basically you don't need to know any scales. But I can understand why people would take exception with that. Let me just say in my defense, I'm an educator, I'm meant to be teaching people. So for me, it's very important to prioritize learning. And for me, like I get a lot of students who come to me and they know all of the chord scales, but they can't actually make a jazz line or they can't play a tune or whatever. So right away, my priorities are, right, let's forget all of that. In fact, I think for anybody interested in learning how to play changes, spending a while forgetting about scales is probably a good idea. But I will talk about some of the strategies for learning scales a little bit later on. I'll just try and touch on them quite briefly. So my story is I read an article a long time ago now by a guitarist called John Etheridge, who's very well known in British jazz circles, and he's generally the guy the BBC go to whenever they got to do anything about jazz guitar, which is not very often, but it does happen. If there's a BBC 3, Radio 3 thing about Wes Montgomery or somebody, he'll be the guy they get. So he said that really scales weren't important in jazz until about 1958. And after that, that was all the thing. And really, if you listen to people like George Benson and Django and so on, Charlie Christian, they were all using chord tones and half steps. This is not true, but it's what I needed to hear. I've transcribed a lot of those guys, and they all use scales. But in fact, actually, the sort of chord scale idea that we have now wasn't really a thing back then. And in fact, actually, what you want to tell somebody who's a student of jazz might be different from the actual unvarnished truth. Okay, so for instance, if we're playing minor 2-5-1, I play a D minor 7 flat 5 chord. I play in this case, a D flat 9, and then I play, some kind of C minor 6, maybe this shape, okay? And then I can break these into arpeggios. I can even use this, right? I can even use the chord shape. If that sounds a little bit like Charlie Christian, well, that's really no surprise, is it? Because that's how Charlie Christian basically improvised. And Herb Ellis and a lot of other people. Now, if you go to somebody who's a gypsy jazz teacher or, for instance, an old school teacher like Carol Kay, they'll tell you that this is the way to improvise over changes. And there's a lot to be said for it. It works right away. You can add in half steps, for instance, if you want to, have a bit more, a little bit more variety. And, you can do all of that embellishment. And then you can almost get things that sound a bit like scales, because really when it comes down to it, chords and scales have a close relationship. But you're gonna be approaching things much more from the point of view of what's in the chord, and then maybe using a bit of basic psychology to surprise us as you play them, and then be able to improvise actually quite complex lines that way. I've done a video on it, which will appear up, maybe up there, maybe the other side. Okay. Now, the thing is that this sometimes gets sort of typified as being a kind of old school way to improvise. Actually, if you listen to Lage Lund, you're going to hear a very modern application of this idea. I often think this often sounds very modern. You can, but Peter Bernstein's another player who uses a lot of chord tones like that, just out of the chord shapes. It's actually a very powerful approach. You can do a lot with it. You're not limited to just playing like Charlie Christian or Herb Ellis, although obviously that's great and those are wonderful players. So I would really work on that for a long time. So do the no scales thing. The thing is, if you've been practicing or learning guitar, you probably already know scales anyway. Hiya, just a quick aside about my gypsy jazz band, Hot Club Jupiter, that's launching their album, or we're launching our album, this Friday at 7:30 British Summer Time, which is 6:30 UTC. Anyway, here's Kit to tell you all about it.
Day became the night. Mad street, in your flat we sat.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name's Kit Massey. I'm the violinist and singer with the Hot Club of Jupiter. We play the music of Stefan Grappelli and Django Reinhardt, and I'm very excited to tell you about our new album, Versus London, an album all about London, in which we present some jazz standards associated with our great city, Nightingale sung in Berkeley Square and A Foggy Day, and also some lesser known musical songs recorded by Stefan Grappelli and Django Reinhardt, and some of our own compositions as well about areas of London. We're very excited to announce that we're going to be launching our album at the London Transport Museum, and you can join us from the comfort of your own homes via a live stream on April the 16th at 7:30. We're going to be joined by the wonderful Kate Mullins of the Papini Sisters, and it might be the only gig that you see this year in front of two amazing London double-decker buses and a tube train. So I hope to see you there, April the 16th at 7:30.
Anyway, so then I would say move on to the next step, which is what Mick Goodrick, the fella behind me on the other side, which way around does my thumb go? That way. Mick Goodrick talks about different modes different ways of thinking about scales, modes. So this is what he would call derivative thinking, which is where we have a relatively small number of scales, but we learn different ways to apply them. Anybody who studied Barry Harris's approach will be familiar with this. Barry Harris uses basically three scales really for his improvisation material. Dominant is the most important one, and that's like a Mixolydian mode for those who don't know Barry's teaching. Minor, which is sort of like melodic minor but with an extra note in there, and major, which is the regular major scale we're all familiar with. And we learn, for instance, to apply the dominant chord or the dominant scale in different situations. So, for instance, if I see a G7, obviously I'm going to play the G dominant. I can also tritone substitute it for like a D flat dominant. Give you more of an altered sound. I can use the same scale, G7 over D minor going to G7, so over a D minor. It sounds great actually. And I'm using all the sort of little language things that we learn from Barry's system, like so-called bebop scales. He doesn't use that term. Little kind of endings and sort of pivot arpeggios and things like that, which we all learn if we study Barry's system. Now the thing is that you can also use that same thing over a B minor 7 flat 5 chord or a B half diminished, as the old players call it. That sounds great, right? So that's three uses of one scale right out the bat. We can use it minor sevenths, we can use it on a dominant chord, or we can use it on a half diminished chord, right? And then minors, you can obviously use a minor, like if you've got G7, you can use a D minor to get a more exotic sound. So this is the Barry Harris version of a minor scale. Similar to a melodic minor, but also with a flat 6. It's kind of like cross between the melodic minor and the harmonic minor. You can use it, to get more of an altered sound. Like that. You can also use it on half diminished chord. So those are all the uses of those two basic scales, and then major just sounds good on major, really. Of course, dominant and major are the same scale from different points of view, but it's worth practicing the dominant on its own just because it's so useful for bop. Now, for non-functional stuff, you have the fact that this is something Evan Marion said that I thought was very interesting. He said that either basically things are major or they're minor. So, for instance, if you've got a D sus chord, that's basically a C major with a D bass. So if I sing the bass, play a scale. It's nice, right? In the same way, if you've got something like a C major 7 sharp 5, and that's really just a minor chord. It's A minor. So most non-Barry people would use an A melodic minor, right? Yeah? Sounds lovely, right? Okay, and that's basically how we sort of interpreted Alan Holdsworth's music. Alan Holdsworth himself has a system of, I think, was it 8 or 10 scales? But, you know, some of them get used a lot more than others, and some of them look a little bit like Barry Harris's scales, you know? So there's not really that much under the sun. Now, the last way, which Mick Goodrick calls parallel thinking, is that sort of thing which gets very confusing and very wordy. So, for instance, when somebody says, okay, I use the G Mixolydian flat 9 13 chord over the G7 flat 9 13. So I can't even say it. It's all that kind of stuff. It's what's the fifth mode of the harmonic major called? You know, it's all this stuff, right? I actually think that this way of thinking would be cleared up if the scales were just given the same name as the chords. So, you know, D minor 6 scale would be melodic minor. We already have it in Barry Harris's system with the dominant, so that's fine. Altered scale, that's a good name. Goes on the altered chord. Fine, no problem. You know, so like, I think that would clear up a lot of problems if people just named the scale every time after the chord and we didn't have any of this kind of horrible mangled sort of like, oh, well, that's the Locrian natural 2 or Locrian sharp 2. I mean, there's not even a good name for that because it depends whether it's natural or sharp and what key you are, you know? So I think it's usually Locrian, I can't even say it, Locrian natural 2 is kind of what I think would be the right name. People seem to call it the Locrian sharp 2, but then wouldn't that only be the sharp 2 if it was in, I don't know. Anyway, so it's an absolute mess, the whole chord scale system, just from the nomenclature point of view. And the other thing I don't really like too much about that system is because it kind of makes you play off the root of the chord every time, and that sounds a bit, you know, it sounds a bit boring after a while. There's a way you can get around it. So the way Adam Rogers, for instance, seems to view it is that, you know, for instance, if you've got a, you know, G13 chord and you want to get a bit more of an interesting kind of a sound, instead of playing the G mode, so playing G Miss Lydian or G, was it Lydian flat 7 or G Lydian dominant, whatever they're calling it these days. Instead, you play like a B, Locrian sharp 2 in this case. It would be, you know, so sounds a lot cooler, right, than going. So that's something that's really important too. Okay, but I find like the nice thing about the other way of doing it, the derivative way, is that actually it kind of does a lot of that for you right away. Particularly if you practice things that kind of move away from the root. Anyway, the last thing is this, what Mick Goodrick calls common tone approach, which I kind of like. I kind of do something a little bit like it. I don't know if it's exactly what he's talking about, but for instance, if I'm playing a blues, start off maybe with a B flat major scale, B flat Ionian, flat in the 7th, go to the E flat chord, and then the 7th of the E flat, which is the third, flattened third of the B flat 7, and then maybe, you know, raise that note to get the diminished. So that's E flat going up to E. So the sharp 4 of the B flat, or the sharp 1 of the E flat, and then raise the 1, flat 6th. I'm talking about B flat, talking about the central key there, and that, you know, allows me to play scales. And I find that really useful for sort of just changing little motifs around and getting the most out of little things I practice. So for instance, you know, I can play a motif like this. right, and so on, right? I just find it's a really, really nice streamlined way of thinking about the different notes. But if you notice, I'm not even really playing chords there, scales there at all. I'm just playing sort of chords. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope that's some help. Don't worry too much about the scales. View scales as resources. View them as nice things to learn, but they're not really necessary. Thanks for watching.